In our last video on Samuel Clarke's cosmological argument, we put the two parts of Clarke's argument together. Remember, part one is simply this principle known as PSR, or the principle of sufficient reason. That is, that there must be an explanation A, of the existence of any being or thing, and B, of any positive fact. And part two of the cosmological argument are the premises. And premise one is that every being that exists or ever did exist is either a dependent being or an independent being. And premise two is that not every being can be a dependent being. The conclusion is that therefore there exists an independent or self-existent being. Let's remind ourselves very quickly how this argument is purported to work. Now, it may be quite easy to see that if we have an infinite chain of dependent beings, this seems problematic. But why is it problematic? Does it violate PSR-A? Does it violate that first part of PSR, that there must be an explanation of the existence of any being or thing? I'm not sure that it does. Pick any of these elephants and I'll tell you where it came from. It came from its mother. That's where it came from. Pick any dependent being, and I could tell you where it came from. It came from the being that preceded it. That's its causal explanation. But I think there's a bigger problem. PSR also demands that there's an explanation for every positive fact. If all we have is an infinite chain of dependent beings going back and 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 back forever, then we do not have an explanation for the positive fact that the set of dependent beings should exist at all, rather than not. If it's just an infinite chain of elephants going back and back and back for forever, or whatever dependent beings they are, there's no explanation for the positive fact that the set of dependent beings exists. Why is there anything? Let's look at some conclusions that fall out of, or some conclusions that we might draw from our review of Samuel Clarke's argument. So, in other words, after carefully analyzing this argument, do I think it's a sound argument? And what kind of final conclusions ought we draw? Well, let's start this way. And first, I want to acknowledge a great debt to my mentor, Dr. William Rowe, to whom I dedicated my first book. Bill Rowe was just one of the great scholars in the philosophy of religion, and particularly in regard to the cosmological argument. Conclusion number one. It seems to me that if PSR-A is true, then it follows that premise one of the cosmological argument is true. All right. Again, it seems to me that if PSR-A is true, then it follows that premise one of the cosmological argument is true. So let's go back and look at these two. So PSR-A supports premise one. PSR A says there must be an explanation of the existence of any being or thing. Premise 1 says every being that exists or ever did exist is either a dependent being or an independent being. Well, if there must be an explanation for the existence of any being or thing, the only causal explanation is that the thing came into existence through the causal activity of another thing, or that it is somehow accounted for through itself. So I think that's clear, right? I think that if PSR A is true, then premise 1 of the cosmological argument is true. Number 2, I think if PSR B is true, it seems to follow that premise 2 of the cosmological argument is true. Let's go back and look at that. Pardon me. So PSR B says there must be an explanation of any positive fact. In this case, a relevant positive fact is the fact that dependent beings exist at all rather than not, that the set of dependent beings exists. If that is the case, that there must be an explanation for every positive fact, then I think premise 2 must be true, that not every being can be a dependent being, because if every being is a dependent being, it's just an infinite chain of dependent beings, then there's no explanation for that positive fact of why the set exists, because we can never get outside the set in order to explain the first member. 3, since the cosmological argument is valid, then if we are convinced that PSR is true, it follows that we should accept the conclusion that there is an independent or self-existent being which causally accounts for the existence of the world and everything in it. Pretty bold statement. But should we accept PSR? Well, I mean, if you asked me how PSR is justified, I'd be hard-pressed to give you any evidence in support of it. Nevertheless, I think it's true, and I think almost every rational person thinks it's true. Perhaps it's impossible to justify because it's axiomatic. That is, something so foundational that there's really no evidence more basic with which to justify it. In any case, I think it is a universal principle of science and, in fact, of epistemology itself. I think it's something that all rational agents share. So, yeah, I think we should accept PSR. Number 5.5. Even if PSR is an assumption that we all share, the premises of the cosmological argument could still be false. Okay. But if PSR is an assumption we all share, I believe we would be inconsistent if we rejected either premise of the cosmological argument. Yeah, that's fair to say. That's short of saying that the argument is sound. Saying that we would be inconsistent to reject either premise is short of calling it sound, but still very strong. So it may be that as rational beings, we should accept the conclusion of the cosmological argument that there is or was a self-existent being or thing. However, I'm not sure that accepting the conclusion of the cosmological argument proves what Clarke thinks that it proves. That is, I'm not sure that it proves the classical conception of the theistic God that we've been discussing. In fact, Long, that's me, Long maintains that the self-existent being or thing could be the universe itself. I mean, to use a very loose metaphor, the universe could be the body of God. Uh, Clarke's argument, interestingly, also does not seem to rule out deistic or polytheistic conceptions of God or gods. Uh, so I'm not sure that Clarke's argument has proven what he has set out to prove, uh, that God, that is, the classical conception of God, exists. But I think that maybe he has established something, that an independent or self-existent being or thing exists or existed, or at least that we would be inconsistent if we didn't believe that.